I want to start by telling you about a stretch of my life when I could not reach my own mind. Not all of it. I was still working, still showing up. From the outside, mostly functioning. But the part of me I had spent my whole life depending on, the part that reasons, that takes a messy situation apart and lays it back out in order, that holds six moving pieces at once and finds a shape underneath them. That part had gone. I would sit down to think through something I knew I could normally think through, and the gears would not catch. The thoughts were there somewhere. I just couldn't get to them. It was like reaching for a tool I'd used 10,000 times and finding the drawer locked, not having the key, not even being able to remember where I'd put the key. This was autistic burnout. I want to describe it precisely because the precise version is the whole point of this episode, and the vague version is useless to you. I'm an autistic leader. For most of my life, that has meant doing, by hand and in real time, a set of things that most people get for free: reading a room, producing a tone of voice that fits the moment, holding eye contact for the right number of seconds, translating the way my brain actually works into the register the room expects. Every one of those is a process that a lot of people runs in the background, underneath awareness, costing them nothing they can feel. In me, they run in the foreground. I pay for each one. For years, I paid quietly on every single interaction, costs that never showed up on anyone's ledger, including my own. That's called masking. Masking works, which is exactly the trap. It works well enough that the cost stays invisible, right up until it doesn't. What happened, eventually, is that the cost outran the budget. The thing that arrived when it did was not ordinary tiredness. I want to be careful to separate those, because we use the same word for both, and they are not the same animal. Ordinary burnout is the exhaustion of overworking. You push too hard for too long, and a real vacation, a couple of weeks of genuine rest, brings you back. What I went through was a different category. It was the kind that comes specifically from carrying the load of operating day after day inside an environment that was built for a different kind of nervous system than the one you actually have. And its signature is not just that you're tired. Signature is the things you could always do reliably your whole life stop being reachable. Let me tell you which things. For me, because the specifics are the evidence. First thing to go was tone. Most of the time, my natural resting affect is fairly flat. That's just how my face and voice sit when I'm not actively steering them. Normally, I can override that. I can produce a warmer tone when the moment calls for warmth, a lighter one when it calls for lightness. In burnout, that override stopped working. The flat affect was almost the only thing I had, even when I caught it. Even when I knew the situation needed something else and I consciously tried to produce it, I couldn't match the right tone to the moment. The instrument was there. I just couldn't play it anymore. The second thing was routine. I have always run on routines to some degree. Most autistic people do. They're load bearing structure. But in burnout, they stopped being a preference and became the only thing holding the day together. Routine broke. I broke with it. There was no improvising around the disruptive plan. Scaffolding had become the building. Third thing was people. I lost more or less entirely the capacity to socialize. Not the desire exactly, the capacity. The thing that lets you sit in a conversation and track it and respond to it in real time simply was not available. I had to step back from a lot of it offline because there was nothing left to spend. And the fourth thing was the reasoning itself. This is the one that scared me, the one I opened with. Cognition I am most known for, the thing I am genuinely good at, the explicit step by step working that is the core of how I lead and how I think. I couldn't reach it. Most reliable part of me had become the least available. I'm telling you this from the other side of it. I'm fully out of burnout now. I have so much of that cognitive capacity back. And from here, with the gears catching again, with the drawer unlocked, I can look back and see the whole degradation clearly, almost from the outside. Honestly, it's remarkable to look at. See laid out exactly how much a system can lose when you run it too far past what was provisioned too long. Watch the skills come back, one by one, as the conditions came down. That last part is the part that tells you what it actually was. Because here's what the recovery proved: none of those skills were ever gone. None of them was a defect that had finally surfaced. The capability had been intact. What had changed was the load. The load came down when I changed the conditions, when I stopped demanding the function that cost the most. The capacities came back. You do not recover a defect by reducing load. You recover an overloaded system that way. The fact that it came back is the proof that nothing was ever broken. Hold on to that, because it's the spine of everything that follows. It was not a defect, it was a load problem. Now, I want to set that down for a moment and tell you about something that has nothing on its face to do with me. And then I'm going to show you how they are the same thing. If you work anywhere that has wired a real AI system into real work, you have probably already lived this. One week, the thing starts getting worse. The answer is thin out. Outputs that were right on the first try suddenly take three. People who lean on it can feel the drop before anyone names it. Here's what does not happen ever in a serious shop. Nobody concludes the model got lazy. Nobody opens a channel to complain that the AI isn't trying hard enough this week. Nobody asks what is wrong with it. They ask one question, and they ask it automatically: what changed in the conditions around it? Is the context full of stale instructions? Is a retrieval step quietly failing so the model isn't answering half blind? Is it running hotter than what it was provisioned for? They open an incident. They restore the condition, clear the context, fix the retrieval, give it back the room it was starved of. The quality comes back. Then, because they're professionals, they write up what the conditions had been doing to the output. The next person inherits the fix instead of the mystery. I do a smaller version of that myself. Both operate these systems and lean on one the way the other people lean on a search warrant. And when the answers degrade, and I'm sure they shouldn't have, my first move isn't contempt. It's diagnosis. Start a clean thread because the old one got polluted. Give it a sharper brief. Check what the shifted upstream this week. I assume the capability is intact and the conditions slip, because that assumption keeps turning out to be the true one. And because acting on it is what gets the work back. We have built an entire profession on exactly that conviction. We call it incident response, reliability engineering, observability, a whole discipline organized around one idea. A system's output is a function of the condition it was given. And the conditions are the thing you fix. We are collectively brilliant. We extend the machine in almost limitless generosity. We assume by default that it's fine and its environment is the variable. And then we walk out of the incident review. We turn to a person who has started to slip and we apply the exact opposite reflex. I know that opposite reflex from the inside because I have been on the receiving end of it for most of my life. If my performance drops, it's almost never read as a conditions problem. Read as me. Not what is this environment asking of him, but what is wrong with him? Too much. Maybe not a culture fit. Maybe he's not trying hard enough. The same drop in output that in a server would have produced a careful incident about in me produces a verdict about my character. So sit with the asymmetry, because the asymmetry is the entire subject of this episode. We reserve our most sophisticated diagnostic generosity for the silicon and our most primitive moral attribution for the mind. When a thing we built degrades, we ask what it needs. When a person degrades, we ask what is wrong with them. That gap between how we read a failing machine and how we read a failing person has a name. And naming it is what I came here to do. Everyone says cognitive architecture now. It's in the keynote titles and the strategy decks and the posts. And almost nobody asked directly can tell you what the phrase actually means. It has outrun its own definition. So let me give you the most honest definition I have, even though it's uncomfortable, because the discomfort is the accurate. Cognitive architecture is the discipline We already run our machines and refuse to run on our people. More plainly, it is the deliberate design of how thinking happens. A single person and in an organization made of people. How cognition gets routed, surfaced, protected, what kinds of thinking an environment is built to draw out, and what kinds it quietly suppresses. It is, in other words, the conditions that a mind's output is a function of. The exact same conditions an engineer would call the system's environment and would never, ever confuse with the system itself. Let me tell you what it is not, because the not its are where most people get stuck. It is not the org chart. The chart tells you who reports to whom. It tells you nothing about how a decision actually gets thought through or whose judgment is even allowed to reach the where the deciding happens. It is not the tech stack. The stack is the tooling that cognition runs on. It is not the design of the cognition itself, and it is not the culture. Culture is the felt residue of the architecture, the mood the design gives off. It's the smell of the room, not the blueprint. Each of those three is a surface you can see. Cognitive architecture is the layer underneath all three, the one nobody ever drew. And you can find it without any of the vocabulary I just used. It is the reason one team's sharpest thinker goes completely silent in the one meeting where the decision actually gets made. It's the reason another team's quietest person is the one the whole room turns toward the moment the problem gets genuinely hard. Nothing in the org chart explained that difference. Nothing in the stack does. Difference is architectural. Our environment was built on purpose or by accident, to route around a certain kind of mind, and the other was built to route toward it. So why did something this fundamental stay invisible for 100 years? That's the part worth slowing down on. Because the answer is not that everyone before us was careless. The answer is that the old industrial operating model never had to design this late. The model existed to maximize one thing: execution, throughput, standardization, the reliable repetition of known work. And in that world, thinking was not a variable you managed. It was a fixed input, assumed, unexamined, handed out in roughly the amount the work was thought to need, not a drop more. You designed the line, you designed the process, you designed the chart. You did not design the cognition, because the cognition was not where the value was getting made. Execution was where the value was made. Here's the rule that falls straight out of that. The rule the whole essay turns on. You do not design what you assume. For 100 years, the architecture of thinking got to stay undesigned because nothing forced the question. The work that paid was execution, and the human being's contribution was measured by execution, which means a mind that struggled to execute in the standard way looked like exactly one thing: defective unit on a line built for a standard unit. And the natural verdict of it on defective unit is that something is wrong with it, not with the line. I want you to hear how directly that lands on the story I opened. For most of my career, the architecture I was standing inside could not tell the difference between a person failing and a person being failed by the conditions built for someone else. It had exactly one category for a drop in my output: defect. In the person, the question was always some version of, what is wrong with him? It was never once, what has this environment been asking of him that it never asked of anyone else? Which is the load question we'd have raised in a heartbeat about any system we'd built ourselves. And then the age of AI walked in and pulled the wall down. Here's what I mean. When execution leaves, when the machine absorbs the throughput, the entire industrial model was organized around, what's left in human hands is precisely the part that was always assumed: the judgment, the framing, the deciding of what is even worth doing in the first place. Thinking layer is suddenly standing there, naked and load bearing, and visible as the place the value now actually lives. Architecture didn't appear. It was always there, holding up the building the whole time. AI just took down the wall that had been hiding it. And once you can see it, you notice something. It is not one thing. It shows up at the four levels at once. All of them basis of the same design. There's how the whole organization is built to think, called the organizational architecture. That's how individual cognitive work gets routed between human judgment and machine execution. The thinking architecture. There's how decisions actually get made, who holds the signal and who holds the call. The decision arc. And there's how meaning survives the trip between minds that don't process the world the same way. The communication architecture. Now, the temptation to hear four and think four separate problems, four separate frameworks, four separate fixes. That's exactly wrong, and I want to dislodge it. These are not four problems. They are four surfaces of one architecture. The same single design decision, whose cognition counts, which thinking is visible, what gets treated as signal, and what gets quietly filed as noise, is legible from all four angles at the same time. Route the cognitive work badly at the thinking level and watch where it comes back up. It resurfaces as a decision nobody can find the owner of, as a translation cost nobody budgeted for, and as an organization that genuinely cannot tell you why its best minds keep walking out the door. One architecture, four faces. The attribution reflex. The machine gets an incident, person gets a verdict reflex, runs through every one of them. An organization that diagnoses its systems and indicts its people does it at every level. It debugs the model and blames the analyst. It ships the broken platform, it upgrades the tooling, and writes up the underperformer. That asymmetry isn't a management quirk. It's the fingerprint of an architecture that got inherited instead of designed. Which brings me to the fork. And the good news. The genuinely useful news is that fork is something you can check yourself today without auditing a single person. Start here. There is no organization without a cognitive arc. Every single one already runs one. The only open question is whether it was designed on purpose or inherited from the industrial model and never once examined. And inheritance is the default. Because the architecture stayed invisible for centuries. And you cannot redesign what you cannot see. So here's the diagnostic. Take the last time a person on your team degraded. Not someone who was always struggling, the reliable one who started slipping, the strong hire who stalled. Now compare and be honest about it. How that was handled against how the same very organization handles a degrading system. The system got an incident. What changed? What is it starved of? What condition do we restore? Person got an assessment. What is wrong with them? Are they still a fit? Do we need to manage them out? The system's degradation got read as information about its conditions. The person's degradation got read as information about their character. That's it. That's the inherited architecture, caught in the act. And notice, I'd ask you to genuinely notice this in yourself. Notice which of those two questions you reach for first, not which one you'd endorse in a meeting about values. Which one fires first, automatically, before you've had a chance to be your better self about it. That reflex is the architecture. The reflex is the thing. Now, I have to be exact about something, because the careless version of this argument is genuinely grotesque. I refuse to leave the door open. Move here is not to treat people like machines. It is not to give the human more compute, optimize their inputs, tune them like a server. That is just the old industrial model wearing a neuroscience costume. And it is the precise opposite of the point. The machine is not the model the person should be assimilated to. Machine is the foil. Only job in this argument is to expose a double standard. Here is the double standard, stated plainly. We extend a conditions-first generosity to the silicon, the working assumption that its capability is intact and its environment is the variable. And we deny that same generosity to the human being sitting inside the very same system. And that's backwards twice over. Because the human is the one who actually has dignity. The human is the one whose capability is intact, more often than we assume, not less. The human has earned more of that diagnostic care than the machine, not equal to it, certainly not less. We have it exactly upside down. Give the thing with no self the benefit of the doubt, and we hand the person with the self the verdict. And I can be specific about how who pays for getting that backwards. Because I'm one of the people who paid. Go back to where I started. The collapse I described, the tone I couldn't produce, the routines that became load bearing, the socializing that went offline, the reasoning I couldn't reach. That was not a defect service. That was a system run so far past its provision conditions, so long that access to its own function started to fail. Masking had been working the entire time, which is exactly why the cost stayed invisible to everyone, including me, right up until it didn't. The capability was real, all the way through. And the recovery was not rest. It was not effort. It was not character. It was the move you would make for any overloaded system on Earth. Reduce the load, change the conditions, stop demanding the function that cost the most. Architecture I was standing inside had already filed the whole thing under the only category it kept for this: defect, a bug in the person, to be located and managed. The same degradation, read two completely different ways, as a conditions problem by the explanation that turned out to be true, and a personal feeling by the architecture that had been setting the conditions all along. So, what does it look like to actually design this thing instead of inheriting it? I want to be honest that it's a posture before it's a toolkit. The posture is the one we already hold fluently toward our machines and have to learn to hold toward our people. When cognition degrades, suspect the conditions first. That's the whole stance. Everything else is operationalizing that one sentence across the four surfaces. And it comes down to four deliberate moves. I'll name them quickly because each one is really the same instinct pointed at a different face. Name the routing. Decide on purpose which cognitive work stays in human hands, which the machine enhances, and which it absorbs whole, instead of letting the routing happen by accident and then calling the accident your strategy. Distribute the decision rights. Pull apart the signal, the call, and the accountability so that no single node, human or model, becomes an oracle that nothing downstream is allowed to correct. Preserve the signal across variants. Build the environment so that a mind which processes differently can land its thinking without first having to reword it into the dominant style and losing half of it in the translation. Protect the integrity work, the deliberate judgment, the principled dissent, the refusal to act under uncertainty. Because that there are named frameworks under three of those moves. And I'll point you to them at the end. But I want to be careful about what they are. The frameworks are the tools. The architecture is the posture. You can hold a posture with no named tools at all and design well. And you can deploy every tool and skip the posture, and all you'll build is a more sophisticated version of the inherited. Measuring people by output with better instruments and still locating every single failure inside the person. The move that matters is the stance underneath. The conditions are the first suspect. In the mind, exactly as in the machine. Let me bring this into land. None of this is new to your organization. Architecture is already there, already running. It's already deciding every single day whose degradation gets an incident and whose degradation gets averted. The only thing actually in question is whether you designed it or inherited it. And now that the term has a definition and the diagnostic is sitting in your hands, architecture stops being a thing you have to discover. It becomes a thing you get to choose. Here's the sentence I'd leave you holding. When a system we built degrades, we ask what it needs. When a person degrades, we ask what is wrong with them. Architecture is the difference between those two questions. So here's the exit, and then one last thing. I don't want to end on a bind. If any of this landed, the full essay is up at theautisticleader.ai. It's called What Cognitive Architecture Actually Means. And it goes deeper on the four surfaces and the three frameworks underneath them. And if you want this kind of thinking week to week, the newsletter is at theautisticleader.substack free. There's no pitch cadence. You can unsubscribe anytime. And I'd genuinely be glad to have you. But I'm not going to end there because the part that matters isn't the subscribe. You don't need me to tell you which question your organization first. You just have to watch what happens the next time someone reliable starts to slip. Watch the reflex. If the reflex is to ask what is wrong with them before anyone asks what changed around them, then you are running an architecture you inherited and never chose. You can choose now. Architecture is yours to design. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next week.